Hello, everyone, and welcome to our advisory body training. My name is Judy Heron. I am the city clerk for the city of Menlo Park. And on behalf of the city of Menlo Park City Council, city manager, and staff, we all want to thank you for your dedication to serve on a Menlo Park commission or committee. As a city council appointed resident member, you are considered a public official serving in an advisory capacity to the city council, performing a valuable service by addressing the needs of your community. The city council is looking forward to your contribution as we work together to provide efficient municipal service that is responsive to local needs and expectations. We really, truly appreciate your willingness to work in this capacity and hope that your experience is stimulating, enjoyable, and satisfying. To my left, I'm not sure on your screen, this is Cara Silver, our interim city attorney. She will be handling further on in this webinar the conflict of interest training. And for now, I am going to be sharing my screen. And with that, I will no longer be able to see myself on camera or any other cameras. So just bear with me as we get to this. All right. Cara, can you confirm that you are able to see the presentation?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Judy.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, guys. So for today, these are the 4 topics that we will be reviewing. It is the Brown Act, public meeting rules, Robert's Rules of Order, and conflict of interest. At the conclusion of each of these 4 sections, we will be going to Q&A, where myself and Cara will be able to answer some of your questions. When we get to that section, you can engage that hand feature, and I believe it's in the bottom section of your screen. I'll be able to unmute your microphone, and you can address myself and Cara for any questions that you may have. All right, so we are starting with the Brown Act. And you can see here just kind of a brief overview of the Brown Act basics. And the basis of the Brown Act is that all legislative bodies, which include city council and city council appointed advisory bodies, meetings are to be open to the public unless explicitly stated in the Brown Act. And going on in this presentation, I will kind of give you some examples of exempt groups. So our traditional Jedi Council, they have an oath which really kind of pertains to the Brown Act, and what it is just knowing that we are working for the people, for the residents, and that they need to be engaged and included. Throughout this presentation, whether we're talking about meetings, conflict of interest, public records, the common thread that ties them all together is truly openness. We want to be open and transparent and get as much information from all stakeholders that are involved. You know, it is the people's business, and the people have the right for this information to be presented to them, as well as legislative bodies, as well as to participate. So kind of a definition of what is a legislative body and who the Brown Act applies to. So we have our elected bodies, such as our city council, and then advisory bodies who are appointed by the city council. That includes all of Menlo Park's committees and commissions: complete streets, environmental quality, housing, library, park and rec, planning, finance and audit, and the sister city committee. All of those are appointed bodies, so the Brown Act does apply. Now, when we talk about the Brown Act, who does it not apply to? Those are groups such as temporary ad hoc committees and some subcommittees that are made up of less than a quorum of the original advisory body, that there is one single task or charge of that subcommittee. And once that is completed, that task or charge is completed, the body is then dissolved. So it's no longer a meeting body. Here we're going to kind of define, you know, what is a meeting, and it's any congregation of a quorum of a legislative body, which is to say an advisory body, at the same time where they're discussing city business. This would include retreats, study sessions, workshops, anything that has to do with city business where a majority or quorum of that group is meeting, that is defined as a meeting. So here we go kind of back into more of the detail of the meetings. The Brown Act, what does it apply to? When we refer to old school and new school, old school are regular and special meetings. The city council has regular meetings every Tuesday or every second and fourth Tuesday of the month. That's a regular meeting. So that, applies, the Brown Act applies to that. When we think of new school, we're kind of getting into that digital time where things like Zoom meetings, GoToMeeting, Skype, Google Docs, emails, things like that. And we need to be cognizant that even virtual communications can be considered a meeting. What we want to avoid are serial meetings, and I will get into more detail and more information about what a serial meeting is and how the Brown Act applies to that. Now, what does the Brown Act not apply to? And I briefly touched on this earlier, where there are certain exempt meetings, right, that the Brown Act does not apply. And that would be conferences, social events, ceremonial. So say that, for like this meeting in general, here we are. I know I might have a quorum of some of the advisory bodies. So I had put out an agenda and I've invited the public to view this. Now, have this been, say, just a social event where all city staff, all advisory bodies, all city council were invited to have dinner at a local eatery? That is not necessarily a meeting because we're not there to discuss city business. We are there, hold on just one moment. And it looks like we had a participant join. Give me just one moment. Okay, I think we're back online. Okay, back up. Sorry about the interruption. So again, things where there's no city business being discussed, there's no action being taken, those are not applicable to the Brown Act and do not have to be agendized in all the different things that the Brown Act requires of us. So again, kind of going back to a serial meeting. A serial meeting is basically a series of private meetings where a majority or quorum of an advisory body or a city council commit to a decision or engage in deliberation concerning public business or city business, and that is a violation of the Brown Act. Serial meetings really deprive the public of the opportunity for meaningful observation and participation when not open to the public. And in this next slide, in the next couple of slides, I will give you some examples of how serial meetings typically occur. So the first one we have here is what we call hub and spoke. So basically here, a serial meeting can happen by, an example is the hub, which is known as member A. Say that person connects with members B, C, and D separately, but on the same city topic. And they've discussed it, they've deliberated, they might even have come to some sort of consensus without it being at a public meeting. That would be a serial meeting and a violation of the Brown Act. Even if, again, it's not a quorum all in one setting, member A could have contacted B, yesterday, contact C today, and D tomorrow. That's still a serial meeting because you're discussing city business without it being an open meeting to the public. The next example we have here is what we call a daisy chain. It's very similar to the hub and spoke. And this is when, again, member A will contact B, and then member B contacts C, C contacts D, and so on and so on. Again, talking about city business, having a discussion. Any of that cannot happen outside of a public meeting where we can engage the public. And I do want to touch on that. in both examples, the hub and spoke as well as the daisy chain, it's not just verbal communications, it's also electronic communications. So things like emails. If you were to send an email to the entire body of your advisory body, so you send it out to all the members, that can be considered either a daisy chain or a hub and spoke, because you're discussing city business with a quorum outside of a set meeting. The best way for you to communicate with other members on your advisory body is through your staff liaison. If you're unsure who that might be, it's available on our web, and you can also contact me and I can let you know who the staff liaisons are. But again, if you need to get information to the majority or the entirety of your advisory body, you do not want to send it directly to them. Go through your liaison and they can send it out. Same thing if somebody does it for you where, maybe somebody didn't know they were supposed to go to their staff liaison and they send an email out, never reply all, go straight to your staff liaison and you can have that one-on-one communication there. Our next one here is it's a helpful tip, is have a Brown Act buddy. Brown Act buddies are basically assigned a certain topic where only 2 members of that advisory body can communicate with each other. So to avoid the daisy chain, to avoid the hub and spoke, have members A and B talk about the master plan only, and they can talk amongst each other about that master plan, but they can't do it with any other members. So Brown Act buddies are super helpful. They're great. The city council has them, and it really helps to avoid any of those serial meetings or any serial meetings where the public hasn't been invited to join. Here are a couple of examples just to kind of break down. The first one says, the chair, so that's the chair of the advisory body, sat down with the planning director. In this case, the planning director is going to be the staff liaison. So the chair sat down with the planning director. From now on, they declared, I want you to provide individual briefings on upcoming agenda items. Some of the material is very technical and the commission members don't want to sound unprepared. Besides, the briefings will speed up the meetings. So the questions you kind of want to ask yourself here is, is there a Brown Act violation in this one example? Is there anything that the planning director should avoid as they meet individually with these members? And so thinking about the first question, is there a Brown Act violation? There is not, because we have the chair, a single member, discussing with the planning director as the staff liaison, and then individually that liaison will connect with each of the members. So there's no Brown Act violation there. However, the planning director or staff liaison in this case does want to be cognizant that they need to respond directly to the chair and then to each individual member without creating any sort of serial meeting. So in our second example here, thanks for the information. These zoning changes can be tricky. Now I am better equipped to make the right decision, said Member Smith. Glad to help, replies the planning director. I am sure Member Jones is okay with these changes. How are you leaning? I'm leaning toward approval, and I know that 2 of my colleagues are definitely in favor. So again, we kind of want to ask ourselves with this example, the same kind of question. Is there a Brown Act violation? Should the planning director disclose how other members are voting? And what are the issues with the members' comment? So off the gate, with the Brown Act violation, we can tell that there's a potential Brown Act violation because we have Member Smith, who already knows how some of those advisory body members are voting. That kind of inclines us to believe that they've already spoken to these members offline outside of a meeting. So there is a possible Brown Act violation here. And regarding the planning director, disclosing any information from other advisory body members, they should not. If Member Jones did speak to the planning director and had a strong feeling of or strong opinion on an item, that is up to the planning director or staff liaison to keep that to themselves. That's not something they can share with any other of the members without, again, with the potential violation of the Brown Act. And so with that, I would like to open up the opportunity for you to ask any questions about the Brown Act. And let me just full screen this. Okay, so if anyone in our attendees list here has a question regarding the Brown Act, please go ahead and engage that hand feature. So it looks like, oh, there we go. So Sean McGuire, you are off mute. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can address.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, sir. Thank you.
Okay. My question is about the daisy chain event. I mean, in the hub event, A is the one who is talking to more than one other member, and knows that they're in violation, or should know they're in violation.
Mm-hmm.
In the daisy chain, if A talks to B, and assumes that B is not going to do anything more, in fact says to B, you know, this is just between you and I.
Mm-hmm.
What position is A then in if B doesn't do what he's supposed to do and goes and talks to somebody else about it?
Great question, Sean. Great question. And so, I mean, it's difficult because it's not like we're pointing fingers, you know, with the hub and spoke. I mean, it is obvious that member A is, you know, the one kind of creating this serial meeting. It's up to the commissioners to just kind of take responsibility. And by providing this training and giving you guys the tools that you need, we are hoping and assuming that, you know, if member A talks to B, then B already knows not to talk to C, D.
Right. But at that stage, A hasn't done anything to violate the act.
That is correct. Yeah. When A talks to B, there's no violation there. It's if B, or yeah, it's if B talks to someone else aside from A.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
If I could also chime in here. Again, this is Cara Silver, interim city attorney. So one thing that in particular the city council does that I think is a very good practice is before any major issue surfaces at the council level, they can establish what we call Brown Act buddies, and Judy had a slide that referenced that. And so in general, I think that members of the legislative body can decide, okay, so on this particular issue, my Brown Act buddy is going to be, you know, member B, and I'm only going to talk to that person. And likewise, the other, you know, legislative member will only talk to their colleague about that particular issue. And so as you start to, you know, get into it a little bit deeper, you can see that you will have essentially partners for lots of these issues. And so we don't really experience many Brown Act problems as a result of that, because council members in advance know who their Brown Act buddy is on a particular issue, and they just don't talk to other members.
Thank you, Cara. That's helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Cara. Okay. So I am going to Henry. Henry, you're off mute.
Good afternoon. Not to complicate what you have to present, which is probably complicated enough, but the idea of two as Brown Act bodies makes sense with a body of five. Our advisory commissions are as likely as not 7 members, in which case, as I understand it, under the Brown Act, you could potentially speak with 2 other members. But of course, both those other members would have to know that the sub-quorum is already achieved. And that no fourth member can be a party to the discussion. Does that make sense?
Yes, Henry, I see what you're saying. So thank you so much for clarifying that. And I believe this is Henry Riggs. Is that correct, sir?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you, Mr. Riggs. He serves on our planning commission, and most of our commissions are at least a 7-member body. So if we had a Brown Act buddy for our 7-member commissions, we could technically have up to 3 without meeting that quorum. But when you start adding, more kind of cooks to the kitchen, you might run into a higher probability of having that Brown Act violation. When we kind of stick with the Brown Act buddy as 2, there's, especially with a 7-member body, there's a little bit more leeway, where if we have 3 and somehow a 4th gets involved, automatically it's a Brown Act violation. So that's why we do recommend the 2. However, understanding that with a meeting body of 7 or more, that less than a quorum is still greater than 2. Does that kind of address your inquiry, Henry?
Oh, yes,
Thank you, sir.
absolutely.
I would also add to that sometimes there may be an absence of 1 or 2 members. When you have larger commissions, you tend to have more absences, and so it could be that actually 3 does become a quorum, and so that's another reason that we encourage you just to have 1 Brown Act buddy. Also, you can have recusals, particularly in the planning commission, where there tends to be more likelihood of a recusal, just because you're dealing with property issues more than some of the other commissions. If there's a recusal, then again the quorum goes down, and so best practice is really just to have 1 Brown Act buddy. But of course, legally, in most circumstances, assuming no absences or recusals, you technically could have 3 members talk amongst themselves without violating the Brown Act.
Thank you so much, Cara. Okay, having no further hands raised, I am going to continue with the presentation. Well, I think I am. There we go. All right, from beginning. And Cara, can you confirm that we are able to see the presentation?
Yes, full
Awesome.
screen.
Perfect. All right, that was our Q&A for the Brown Act. All right, so we are moving on to the public meeting rules. And here we are going to provide some of the basic information for, how we engage the public and let them know about, the who, the what, the when, and the where. The agenda is really what we call setting the stage. So agenda basics, here you'll see a bulleted list that kind of gives you, again, just the basics of an agenda. The posting of 72 and 24-hour notice, those are required by the Brown Act. So we're governed by that. For regular meetings, we need minimum 72-hour agenda posting, and for special meetings, a minimum of 24 hours in advance. Of course, we strive to exceed those and get them out sooner, but those are our requirements. The agenda is typically set by the chair and the staff liaison, and it provides a time and location of the meeting. It'll provide agenda titles and a brief description of those. And just as a reminder, anything that is not on the agenda cannot be discussed. So only agendized items can actually be discussed during a meeting. Our next one here is our meeting basics. Establishing a quorum. A quorum is the majority of the members, and they must be present at a meeting. If there is no quorum, then the meeting cannot be called to order, and that can be done either before the meeting is actually going to occur, or it has happened where there just isn't a quorum at the start of the meeting and the meeting is officially canceled, and they will either wait till their next regularly scheduled meeting or schedule a special meeting. So a little tip there is if you know you're going to be absent from a meeting, to let your staff liaison know as soon as possible. That way they can make sure that there is a quorum and that they can hold the meeting. So again, meeting basics. So we're at call the meeting to order. That is required. The meeting has to be called to order. And for oral communications, the public has a right to speak on items not on the agenda. And that is during the general public comment period of a regular meeting. So during regular meetings, the public can make general comments for items that are not on the agenda. But as I mentioned before, the commissioners cannot discuss items that are not on the agenda. So they just have to hear the public comment, take it in. They can ask staff to do a brief response, but again, you cannot talk about things that are not on the agenda, and general public comment at regular meetings is for items not on the agenda. Gives the public an opportunity to express an opinion, a concern on something that maybe isn't agendized. In regards to agenda items, the public has the right to provide comment on any actual agendized item, and the chair will take that public comment before the body actually votes on that item. And again, the adjournment of the meeting that does have to occur. You can't just stop meeting. You actually have to formally adjourn that meeting. And that is all we have for public meeting rules. So I'm going to ask again for anyone who's got a question on what we just saw regarding public meeting rules to raise their hand, and we'll be able to answer those questions for you. Okay, seeing no hands raised, we will continue with the presentation. All right, so here we're going to speak about Robert's rules. What Robert's Rules of Order is, it sets out the parliamentary rules and guides for establishing the conduct of the organization and the management of its meetings. So basically it's, how to conduct yourself in a meeting. Excuse me. So the chair is the chair of the meeting. They control the meeting and they have a lot of responsibility, and Robert's Rules kinds of explains that. It also touches on how actual advisory body members should work within a meeting. So agenda items, the chair must clearly state the agenda item and the number and the subject if it's written. For example, D1, minutes from the February 20th meeting. When it comes to reports and recommendations, typically staff will either present a slide deck or a verbal report for each of their items, and then questions from each of the advisory body members can be taken. Any questions, comments, those will all be taken before there's any action on that agenda item. And then we've got public comment. The chair must allow public comment and input for all agendized items. The chair isn't allowed to pass over someone. The same amount of time has to be given to all who wish to speak for public comment. General rule is a 3-minute public comment rule per person, and the chair must allow, again, all of that to happen. If you happen to have a public hearing on one of your agendas, you formally have to open and close the public hearing. I know Planning Commission will have public hearings a lot. City Council has public hearings. I'm not sure if many of the other advisory bodies will see that often, but the chair must open and close those public hearings. Continuing with Robert's Rules, we have member discussion. So the members who have questions or comments on agenda topics, they must be heard, and they must be recognized by the chair before speaking. So the chair has to allow all of the members to provide their input, their comments, their questions, but it's typically done with the chair recognizing that member, and then the member will speak. And then the chair will go to the next member and allow them to speak. And regarding motions and actions, so this is the actual kind of the meat of the meeting. This is where, you know, the advisory body is going to actually approve or dissent on an item. And so the chair will invite for the motion. The chair will typically call, do we have a motion on item C1, approval of the minutes? And then one of the advisory body members will say, yes, I'd like to make the motion. The chair will then call for a second. Do I have a second to approve item C1, approval of the minutes? And what's interesting here is that you can second a motion even if you plan to vote no. Even if you're in dissension, you can make the second to the initial motion. This third bullet says optional clarifications, amendments, and substitutions. On rare occasions, we'll have a motion on the floor, we'll have a second, and then we'll have what they call a friendly amendment. So maybe in this case, you know, the motion is to approve item C1, approval of the minutes, but my friendly amendment is to correct the spelling of, you know, one of the public speakers. So in that case, if the friendly amendment is accepted by the person who's made the motion and made the second, that can be done. But again, it's a very rare occasion where there'll be an amendment to the actual motion. Typically, all of that discussion has already happened and it's in the motion initially. The last step for the action is to call for a vote. With our virtual meetings, we're doing roll call vote, so that way people can actually see and hear the vote. When we're in our normal setting in a room, you know, we can just raise a hand or just say aye. But for our virtual meetings, we're definitely doing roll call votes. So the staff liaison will typically call out each of the members' names and accept their verbal vote. And then at the end of the vote, the staff has to announce those results. So, you know, the motion passes 3-2 with Smith and Jones dissenting. And dissenting is just saying that they said no. And that concludes Robert's Rules of Order. So if anyone has any questions on Robert's Rules of Order, go ahead and engage that hand feature and we can answer those for you. Hi, Henry. You should be off mute.
Hi, Judy. I just wanted to note, having read Roberts, Roberts is a bit more extensive than that. Can you refer commissioners to where they could find the full text of Robert's Rules of Order?
Sure. I had emailed out the handbook, which does provide that. I can send it out again. We've made some updates. We pretty much update it every year. So I'll resend that. And I can also include a link directly to some helpful Robert's rules, because there are, you're right, this was a very high level kind of overview of them. So it would probably be most beneficial. So thank you for that.
Oh, I apologize. I didn't notice your attachment on the email.
No worries. No, I appreciate you bringing it up because it is important, and you are correct that, like I said, this is a very high level. It's not a very in-depth. It's just, you know, kind of a start place. But the handbook has amazing information, so good resource.
Okay, so it's not an attachment, it's a link?
The handbook is an attachment. It should have been in a PDF form, and it's a fairly large attachment, including it includes Robert's Rules, the Brown Act, I think some conflict of interest. Let me see.
So this didn't go out with your email on July 27.
No, it wasn't attached to.
It was a previous one.
It might have been something previous. I think it might have been attached when I sent out the poll initially. And it's the Advisory Body Handbook of 2020. And its appendices have Brown Act, Robert's Rules, the travel policy, and the anti-harassment policy, and then the commission committee policy.
All right, terrific. Thank you.
Oh, of course. All right. So I'm seeing no further hands raised, and I am going to turn this over to Cara for the conflict of interest. So let me go ahead and share my screen again. You able to see it okay, Cara?
Yes. Perfect.
Awesome.
Okay. So the last part of this presentation is going to deal with conflicts of interest. As public officials, we always have to take into account any appearance of impropriety. And so that's what the conflict of interest rules are designed to address. Next slide. The most significant set of conflict of interest rules are contained in the Political Reform Act. And this was an act passed in 1974, and it governs a whole series of issues. It deals with disclosures of political campaign contributions, spending by candidates and ballot measure committees. It also sets out ethics rules for state and local government officials that impose strict limits on decisions or votes that affect the officials' financial interests. And it also regulates lobbyists' financial disclosure and lobbying practice. The California Fair Political Practices Commission, commonly known as FPPC, is the state commission responsible for administering and enforcing the Political Reform Act. Next slide. So under the Political Reform Act, there used to be an 8-part test. For those of you who have been on the commission for a while, you may remember the 8-part test. It was recently limited to a much more manageable 4-part test. And so these 4 factors are, first of all, you need to analyze whether you as a public official are actually participating in a decision that could have a economic impact on one of your interests. The second issue is, to what extent will that decision affect your economic interest? The third issue is, will that economic interest be, quote, reasonably foreseeable and, quote, material? And of course, these are terms of art, and there are literally 10 regulations that deal with defining these critical terms. And then the fourth issue to analyze is whether there is an exception that applies. Next slide. So in terms of the first issues and the standard forms of financial interest that are covered by this conflict of interest regulation, we typically look at real property. And that's really the most common type of conflict of interest that we have. As I mentioned before, the Planning Commission typically involves decisions that pertain to real property or that could have an impact on real property, whether the commission members own their own residential single-family residence, or whether they have investment property in the city of Menlo Park, or whether they have a leasehold interest in Menlo Park. Any of those real property interests could trigger the financial interest portion of this test. Also, of course, sources of income are included. Gifts are included, and there's another set of regulations in the Political Reform Act that I do want to bring to your attention, and that is that you can only receive gifts of up to $500, and any gift in excess of $500, you are not permitted to accept that if the contributor would be doing business in the jurisdiction. So you also want to watch out for that. But even if you receive a low level gift, you know, a bottle of wine that's valued at $100, and the person that gave you that gift is appearing before your commission, then you need to analyze whether the particular decision at issue would disqualify you from voting because of the gift. Some of the other conflict, some of the other sort of, they don't come up as often, but of course, if somebody gives you a loan, or if you provide a loan to somebody else, if you have a contract for the purchase of sale of goods or other things, that could also be an economic interest under this statute. And then finally, an important practice tip to remember is that your spouse's financial interests and income are also subject to the Political Reform Act. So if, for instance, your spouse worked for Facebook and Facebook came to your commission for on a particular issue, you would be possibly recused because of your spouse's income from Facebook in connection with that particular decision. One other thing with ownership of real property, this is something that, as I mentioned, comes up frequently. And what the commission has done now is set up a new set of regulations. We talked about it last year in the training, and for those of you who are new or missed last year's training, there was a pretty significant change in the ownership of real property regulations. And we call it the donut rule because there are 3 different areas that you can fall under. So if you own real property where the decision that is before your board is involves some property that is within 500 feet of the property that you own, then there's a presumption that you will be conflicted and will have to recuse yourself. You can overcome that presumption by producing evidence that you would not be impacted by the decision, but for the most part, if a decision is within 500 feet of property that you own, you will probably have to recuse yourself. The second bucket is any property that, any decision involving property that is more than 1,000 feet from the property that you own or lease, is presumed to be not a conflict. So it's good that we now have some concrete rules. So anything more than 1,000 feet away from the property that you own or lease is presumed not to be pose a conflict. Where the gray area is for all the properties that are within 500 feet of your property and 1,000 feet. And that's what we call sort of the donut hole. That's the area where you will have to do some analysis. And you look at factors such as, is the decision that is affecting the property going to change the income producing potential of your property? Would it change the market value of your property? Or would it change the highest and best use of your property? You would also look at whether the decision would change the character of your property. And changing character could result from things like altering traffic patterns, increasing parking in your neighborhood, views, privacy, and noise impacts. And I know that the Complete Streets Commission frequently will deal with issues involving change of character. And so we've analyzed a lot of these issues for the Complete Streets Commission over the years. The other aspect of real property that comes up is if a person leases their property. So if you're renting a home or an apartment building, if you have a month-to-month lease, the conflict rules at this stage do not apply. So again, these rules kind of change throughout the years, but as of right now, the regulation says that if you have a month-to-month lease, it does not invoke the real property regulations. However, if you have a longer term lease, and most leases are a year, in fact, the City of Menlo Park has a minimum 1-year lease ordinance. So most of the apartment leases that we see are at least 1 year. Then the act is triggered and you look at certain factors again, and sort of similar to what I was describing with the real property in the donut hole. So you would look at whether the decision would change the termination date of the lease. Would it increase or decrease the rent that is payable under the lease? Or would it create changes in the allowable uses on your property? And if any of those factors applied, then you would have a real property interest under the Political Reform Act. And so you would move on to the next issue. So with that, we can advance the slide, Judy. So once you've determined that you have a conflict of interest, what you need to do is you need to announce the basis for your conflict of interest. So if it's a real property interest, you would announce that you have a property within, say, 500 feet of the property that is the subject of the decision. You don't have to announce the exact address of your property, particularly if it is a residential property. But you want to at least give the public some notice of why you are disqualifying yourself. The public wants to know whether it's a real property interest or whether it is because of a source of income, stocks, whatever. It's important to just let the public know what the actual financial interest is. And then what happens is that you cannot participate in the decision at all. You can't even you can't hear the presentation, you can't be in the room for the discussion, and you obviously cannot vote on the project. And then what we do in-person meetings, we actually have the recused commissioner leave the room, and then we will call you back when the matter is over, and then you can participate in the remainder of the agenda. For Zoom and GoTo meetings, what we've been doing is asking the commissioner or council member to disengage their web camera and their microphone, and that is the way that they disengage and recuse themselves. Next slide. So I mentioned that there is an exception to the conflict of interest rules, and this has not come up historically in Menlo Park, but it certainly could. And that is that in order to render a decision, the advisory board has to have at least a majority or what we call a quorum of members present. So as Judy mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, if you don't have a quorum of your commission, you just legally cannot act. So if you have a 5-member commission and 2 members or 3 members are absent, so that you only have 2 members, you cannot take any action legally. And so to get around that rule and to allow for some form of action, the FPPC has created a rule of necessity. And what happens there is that all of the conflicted members put their name into a hat, and then typically the staff liaison or the city clerk would draw a name from the hat, and that person would then be able to participate in the decision. It is done by random selection, and it does mean that somebody who has a conflict of interest legally is permitted to participate in a decision, but only because of this rule of necessity. Also, if there is any additional action with respect to the particular project, you don't go, oh, you don't do another selection, but that person who was selected the first time is automatically put onto the committee and can participate throughout the process. Next slide. So in terms of penalties, there are penalties for violation of the Political Reform Act. You may remember a few years ago that a local city council person from Redwood City was fined under the Political Reform Act for violating a conflict of interest rule over the Cargill Salt Works development project. She was heading an economic group that endorsed the mixed-use project that was being proposed for the Cargill site. And the FPPC found that that was a conflict of interest, and she was fined $3,000 for participating in the decision. Next slide. Another issue that comes up is not related to the Political Reform Act, but is related to the, it's called common law bias. And this is a situation that prevents public officials from participating in decisions if they feel that they are biased against a particular applicant, or if they think that their personal interests would dictate their ultimate decision. Next slide. So there are a couple of caveats here. First of all, it only applies to quasi-judicial actions. Most of the commissions, again, do not take quasi-judicial actions. The Planning Commission routinely does take quasi-judicial actions. Sometimes the Complete Streets Commission will take a quasi-judicial action, and that's where an applicant applies for a specific permit. And that's the case where common law bias would apply. In situations where, for instance, the Environmental Quality Commission is making a decision or a recommendation to the council on whether to adopt the Climate Action Plan, for example, that would be an example of what we call a legislative decision, and that would not invoke common law bias. In terms of this principle, again, the common law bias, you don't need to have a particular economic interest. Again, it's based on just a personal bias. And it's triggered by this personal interest or bias. And in these situations, the official should recuse themselves. And the penalty for violating this is that a applicant who is aggrieved by this decision can later file a lawsuit against the city, and the decision can be invalidated. Next slide. So one final note in terms of overall ethics training and forms, we do have a state requirement called AB 1234, that's the name of the bill, and it's referred to, this ethics training is typically referred to by the bill name. And it's a requirement that any local official who receives a compensation or stipend or reimbursement take an ethics training class for a minimum of 2 hours every 2 years. And this AB 1234 training typically applies to the city council. I've forgotten, and maybe Judy, you remember whether the Planning Commission also is subject to this because of any stipends they receive or reimbursements. It may be that they would also be required to take AB 1234 training.
According to my recollection, yes, the Planning Commission is also required to do the AB 1234.
Great, thank you. And then likewise, there is a Form 700 that certain public officials and certain commissioners or commissions, and certainly the city council, are required to fill out. And the Form 700 requires certain disclosures be made. And again, this primarily applies to the city council, but Form 700, you need to report, of course, any investment of over $2,000. You need to report real property interests, although your home is exempt from disclosure. And you must report sources of income and gifts of over $50 on this Form 700. And I think that that is the last slide, and we have a few minutes for questions and answers.
Thanks so much, Cara. Do have a couple of hands up here. Give me one moment. We'll start with John Pimentel.
Thank you, guys. This is really helpful. I have maybe a theoretical point, not a practical one, but let's say I own stock in a publicly traded company, maybe even through a mutual fund. Let's just say it's Lennar Homes, and I'm on the Housing Commission, and Lennar Homes is planning to do some big development, and the Housing Commission's asked to make some point of view on it. Would that be a situation that's disclosable or a conflict of interest where I should recuse myself just because I own the stock of that publicly traded company?
Right. So these issues tend to be pretty technical, and with respect to your particular example, there is an exception for mutual funds. So mutual funds, any stocks owned through a mutual fund actually is exempt, and so you wouldn't have to recuse yourself. If you own the stock outright, there's a particular threshold for which type of stock, of how much stock would rise to the level of a conflict. And I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. We'd have to look at them, and there are different numbers for different types of stocks. So unfortunately, you do need to be self-aware of your ownership interests if you do own stock outright. It's unusual to have stock conflicts in the city. We certainly have a few of them. I mean, if you own stock in Facebook, for instance, and a Facebook project comes in, obviously you should check with us or check with the FPPC as to what the threshold is.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
And likewise, just a corollary, if there's a real estate position that is outside of the county or far, far away, is that something that needs to be disclosed or considered in conflict of interest?
A real estate position, as in you own real estate?
Right.
Yes. So because the real property rules are really tied to proximity, so it's, if it happens to be right on the border and it's within 500 feet of if the decision is within 500 feet of the property that you own, but the property happens to be outside the city of Menlo Park, in that particular situation, yes, you would have to recuse yourself. But in most situations, you're probably going to be pretty safe if the property is outside of Menlo Park.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks, John. Okay, and going to open up Henry's mic. Mr. Riggs?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cara, during your presentation, you were talking about leases and lease terms. I'll note, by the way, that most one-year leases roll over into month-to-month leases,
Yes.
which presumably would make them exempt from the rule. You didn't mention, though, whether you were talking about a commissioner who was a lessee or a lessor. Would it apply to both?
No, thank you. That's a very important distinction, and clarifying that. Yes. So the lease portion of my discussion assumed that the commissioner was a lessee, a tenant. And so the rules that I discussed regarding month to month and year apply to tenants. If you own an apartment building or a house that you rent to somebody else, that would be governed by the real property ownership rules. And so it would, the proximity to the property that's subject to the decision would apply.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. And our next question is coming from Sean McGuire. Sean, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay. That was very helpful. I just have one question which doesn't apply to me, but it just popped in my head, and that is these reporting requirements, the 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it was, and the Form 700. Do those become public documents?
Yes. So the Form 700 is a public document, and so in fact, the Form 700 frankly discourages some members from participating or running for council or running for an elected office because they don't want to disclose their financial interests. But once you get into the public realm, there are these requirements, and yes, they are public record.
You anticipated my thought process there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sean. And Karen Grove, you're off mute.
Okay, so my question was inspired by John Pimentel's question and the answer to it. So the Housing Commission votes a lot on, or discusses and votes on recommendations related to tenant protections. And so I'm wondering if landlords, people who own property and rent it in Menlo Park can vote on those, because that's actually a much more direct impact economically than the situation that John was describing, or even being an employee of Facebook, because the impact of any decision we make about real estate or zoning to Facebook, you could argue it's going to have zero impact on the value of Facebook stock or the salary of the employee.
Yes, yes, that's correct.
And so my question is, like, given the magnitude and the direct connection between the vote and the impact, my understanding is that landlords can vote on tenant related policies. So how does that make sense? Right.
So again, it will depend on the particular legislation. In general, most sort of legislative decisions and policy recommendations are sort of, they apply citywide. And so there's another applicable exception that if the impact is going to be the same citywide and it won't have any particular impact on the property that you own, that is distinguishable from, properties across the city, then there's an exception for that and it doesn't pose a conflict. And so that's the way we've analyzed most of the tenant protection issues, is that we're not singling out any particular property. if the legislation came down to only, properties with 100 units or more are subject to this particular legislation, and there was only, one or two properties that had more than 100 units, and one of the commissioners or one of the council members happened to own one of those properties, that might be a different situation. So it is analyzed on sort of a case-by-case basis. So I can't answer it any better than that at this point.
It's the argument that it affects every landlord the same. I hear that and I understand it. However, not every resident of Menlo Park owns and rents property, and some, almost half, rent property. So I don't buy it. I mean, I hear the logic, but it does create a conflict to the duty to serve all of the residents in Menlo Park.
Right.
And I say this as a new landlord. So like, I'm not like pointing this at anyone in particular, except for potentially myself. So
right. So actually, there are some specific regulations that deal with this particular exception on when the legislation affects a large swath of properties. And again, they have specific thresholds, and maybe what I'll do is I'll send this email list, that regulation, because it is helpful. And there are some very specific metrics that go into the decision.
Okay, thank you.
To determine whether it is, a generally applicable regulation that is applied pretty even-handedly, or whether it only impacts a few different residents. So there are some metrics.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. All right, so I have no further hands raised. Again, you are more than welcome, anyone who is joining us this evening, to send me an email, leave me a voicemail. I'm always responsive. If anything comes up following this that you have a question on, as with Cara, I can get you in touch with her as well. And I do want to thank you again just for serving on a Menlo Park body. It's huge, and we really appreciate just the commitment just to make Menlo Park an amazing community to work, live, and play, and have a wonderful evening. And I hope all of you and your families are staying healthy and happy. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you.